haven't checked the weather yet, but I know it is the perfect day to chat about adult Jewish literature. I'm Cheryl Stahl. Thanks for joining me here at Nice Jewish Books. I don't usually do 3 historical novels in a row, but since I bounced from biblical times to the 1970s, I figured I could get away with this one, which is more turn of the century. So today I am delighted to welcome Miriam Flock to talk about her book, Wild Grapes. Welcome, Miriam.
Great to be here.
So please tell me about your book.
Well, Wild Grapes really takes off from family stories. My grandparents were both sides were part of the Jewish Back to the Land movement and lived on farms in Geneva, Ohio. And I grew up hearing all these great stories about them. I actually really didn't know either of my grandfathers and I thought I knew, but didn't really know my grandmothers until I started paying more attention to these stories and realized really what remarkable women they were. So this book is kind of a tribute to my grandmothers and really trying to imagine myself back into what it would have been like to come from Europe, where most Jews were coming to big cities and there was a big Jewish community, but instead they went to these tiny towns and started farming, which they knew absolutely nothing about. So it seemed like a really interesting story and one that I think a lot of American Jews don't know anything about.
Right. I had heard a little bit of it, but it was more in terms of chicken farms in New Jersey, not really sending people out, not so far west, sending people out to other regions. So Geneva, Ohio is a little ways south of Cleveland. I was about to do something very LA and say it's about 2 hours south, but back in the early 1900s, without the roads and in cars at that time, maybe it's only 45 minutes south now.
Right. It was a ways at the time, but they were on an interurban railroad and they certainly had connections with the Cleveland Jewish community, which I think at that time was the second largest Jewish community in the United States.
So this focuses on Bluma, who brings her 3 daughters from Romania to track down her husband in Ohio. He'd been there for 4 years, promising he was going to send money to bring her and the daughters over, and he still hadn't gotten around to it, and her patience has worn out. So she shows up at his farm, almost fresh off the boat, and her cousin from Cleveland drops her off, but the road is so bumpy he can't drive it up. So she and the daughters are walking up, and they finally get to a clearing. And she said, in the center is the most dilapidated house I've ever seen. And I come from a village of thatch roof cottages. So he's on this farm, but it is not much of a farm. The house is in disrepair. And he's hanging out with a bunch of buddies, studying Talmud and singing, and which nothing wrong with that, but he's not farming.
I think my grandfather actually was a member of a small group of men who were all eventually, they thought, going to go to Palestine. And they went first to the United States, where they thought they would develop the skills that they needed when they went to the Promised Land. And they sort of assigned these roles. Somebody was supposed to be a dentist, and my grandfather had been a horse trader. So they said, okay, you'll be a farmer. And they thought, how hard could it be? Well, it turned out to be quite difficult and very much at odds with the kind of life that he wanted to live, which was a life of study. So they had a partnership that I think is not unlike the way some Orthodox marriages still work, where the man studies and the woman is kind of the conduit to the outside world and the practical one who makes things work. My dad said his mother would always try to make it sound like his father was doing the decisions about the farm. But as they got older, they realized she really ran the place.
Yeah, so Bluma shows up and finds out that not only is in the farm in a disastrous state, but he's behind on his mortgage. So she ends up pulling out the last bit of money that she had saved to pay the mortgage so that they can stay on the farm, and figures out right away that she has to be earning money. So she sets up a little farm stand with her daughters and, is trying to figure out other ways to make money. She's a weaver by trade. So she sets up her loom again and hopes to do some of that. And she has big dreams for her daughters. She wants them to have the education she never had. She wants them to have opportunities. She wants them to be able to marry for love, which she didn't have and definitely doesn't have at this point. And one by one, those dreams for her daughters became difficulties. Can you talk about that?
I want to say as context, it was extremely, well, first of all, Jewish girls in Romania couldn't get an education at all because the schools, public schools were closed to them, and the Jewish community had managed to set up some yeshivot, but girls got no education. So part of what Bluma wanted in coming to the United States was to provide an education for her girls. It should be noted in the United States, lots of girls and boys didn't finish high school in those days. I think the figure is about less than 30%. So this dream was unusual. A lot of kids got taken out of school to work on the farm, as Sala ends up by having to do. But that was really quite common in those years. So the first daughter, Sala, the eldest, is hoping to go to school, but it's clear immediately that the farm is so derelict that they're going to need her help. She's about 15 at the time. So she's pulled out of school, which is a terrible disappointment to her. Chaya, the middle daughter, is really the scholar of the family, and she tutors, she's raising money, and she actually hopes to go to college, which is practically unheard of. She gets a scholarship. She's raised her own money through tutoring. And then her father decides he's keeping the money for her, that he's going to use it to buy a car that he thinks the family needs. He doesn't tell her about it, and he's sure he's going to be able to put that money back. But in fact, they have a terrible frost, and their grape harvest is destroyed, and he loses all of her money. So she is unable to go to college as she plans. Eventually, I think of all three girls, Raisel's the youngest, and she's a kind of a violin prodigy and hoping to go to conservatory where she also gets a scholarship. He would like her to stay home and try to rescue the family farm during the Depression. But finally, he realizes that he's really imposing his dream on the girls, and he lets her go off. And the older girls also, they make their own luck, basically. Chaya figures out a way to go to college, and Sala really starts the winery with her husband. So they make their own lives, I think, but with Bluma's belief in them really makes the difference in their being able to think these things are possible for them.
Yeah, so you mentioned making wine. So their chief crop is grapes, which even though I lived in Ohio for quite some time, I don't remember it being like a wine capital of the U.S. But they had a grape harvest and made wine, and this also was when the Prohibition started. So can you talk about how they could get around those rules?
Sure. I should say that the Jewish farmers were responsible for about 60% of grape production in Ohio, and they started this, or were instrumental in starting this viticulture industry, which still goes on. I gave a reading at a winery in Geneva, and there's still a number of them. They make Concord, mostly sweet wines.
Wow.
So yeah, they're still around. Prohibition started, there was an exception for sacramental wine, and so they could continue to make the kosher wine. Although in the book there's a sheriff who is really trying to undermine their operation, but they find their ways around him.
Yeah, there was a really fun scene where the sheriff comes to the door hoping to catch them, drinking the wine. And he says, can I have some? Oh, of course, of course. And they hand it to him. And he goes to take a sip. And it's like, well, wait, you have to say the prayer first, and they rattle it off in Hebrew. And of course, he can't. So he, realizes he can't catch them for improper use of this wine. Yeah, so they had fled Europe, obviously, because of the anti Semitism and pogroms. And then land and the KKK is active in that area. Can you talk about the anti Semitism they encountered?
Sure. I was somewhat surprised about this. There's a wonderful book called A Fire in the Heartland that talks about this resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Their activities in the South had really calmed down by the turn of the century, but they were rejuvenated in the Midwest, headquartered in Indiana, actually, but there was a huge Klan population in Ohio. They threw a picnic at Buckeye Lake where there were 70,000 Klansmen who attended. And
Wow.
there weren't, at that point, all that many Black people up north. So they set their sights on immigrants, particularly Catholics and Jews. And my father talked about a cross burning in Harpersfield, which is a very small town near Geneva. And there were certainly anti-Semitic neighbors. There was a mix, but even when I was a child, we lived in Chagrin Falls, Ohio, and my parents brought us into Cleveland because there was still a fair amount of hostility toward Jews or just ignorance about, rural America. They frequently really had no experience with Jews.
Yeah, that was one lovely relationship was between Bluma's family and the Italian family nearby. That since they were both kind of treated with suspicion by the rest of the town, they kind of connected with each other.
And also this family, all American, the Blankenships, who taught them how to use the sugar bush that existed on their farm, and were helpful in Bluma getting her citizenship. So there were certainly neighbors who were friendly, but there were also hostile neighbors.
So you mentioned that they lost a crop due to the frost. So the weather is always an issue when it comes to farming. But they also had other troubles, and one of that was the so-called Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919 that, really swept around the world. But can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was really interesting research for me. I had a lot of family stories that talked about some of these issues, but no one ever mentioned what they did during the Spanish flu. So I had to do some research on that, but certainly it affected Geneva as it did everywhere around the world. And they, in the book, Chaya brings it home from school, and the entire family is infected except for Sala, who they managed to kind of quarantine so that she can continue to both take care of them and take care of the farm. But it decimated many families entirely. And in their case, prayer sort of got them through.
I always learn things from the books, but when they started having the Spanish flu, I also looked into it a little bit. And I hadn't realized that the reason it's called the Spanish flu was even though it had been already seen in America and all around Europe, because of the war, a lot of the newspapers didn't report it because they didn't want this bummer of a news with the war going on. So they sort of suppressed it. And since Spain was not involved in World War One, they reported it. So it became the Spanish flu.
Interesting.
So I thought that was kind of fascinating. So you mentioned the Back to the Land movement. Can you talk more about that
Sure.
and how that manifested in the United States?
Sure. There were several kind of generations of the Back to the Land movement. The first, I think, was Am Olam, where there were these kind of communal settlements. They were very utopian, and most of them failed. Then there were Jews who tried to take advantage of the Homestead Act, which gave 160 acres to citizens and would-be citizens in areas that were not very easy to farm. So North Dakota, South Dakota, where they had short growing seasons and droughts and frosts and no way to get their crops to market. And most of those failed. And sort of into the middle of this stepped Maurice de Hirsch, known as the Baron de Hirsch. He was at one point, they think, the richest man in the world. He built the Orient Express, and he decided that he was going to devote his fortune to helping his co-religionists, as he called them, lead a more dignified life. At first, he thought he would work with the Russian government and get Jews settled in farmlands in Russia, but he soon realized that the Tsar was really out to exterminate the Jews, and he decided that rather than try to help Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe, he would try to bring them to the United States and also to South America and Canada, where they could lead lives of dignity. And he thought it would be better for them not to be in these kind of crowded ghettos, but to have their own piece of land. Their motto was free farmers on our own soil. And so he started the Jewish Agricultural Society, which helped with loans for buying farms and then education. They had a farm school. They had agents who went around and helped Jewish farmers who, as I mentioned about my grandparents, they didn't know anything about farming. They hadn't been allowed to own land in Eastern Europe and Russia, so they were really starting from scratch. And as they went along, the Jewish Agricultural Society figured out ways to help them be successful. You mentioned chicken farms. There was one out here in Petaluma, as a matter of fact, and a lot of them in New Jersey and Connecticut. And they turned out to be kind of a good approach for new immigrants because they didn't require good soil. They didn't require a lot of kind of background in farming. You could do it as a family operation. And originally, they settled the Jews who immigrated at the turn of the century. But then as those farms began to empty out and there were refugees from the Holocaust, these turned out to be good places also to settle them. So the Jewish Agricultural Society was active until the 1970s. And what happened to those farms happened to many American farms. The corporate farms took over. The cities started to move out into the suburbs, and it became more advantageous financially to turn those farms to develop them as housing or manufacturing than to actually work them as farms. So the Jewish Agricultural Society kind of went out of business in the 70s. There is now an organization called the Jewish Farmer Network that is a kind of community for Jewish farmers all over the United States.
Sender, Bluma's husband, was kind of funny about the way he learned about farming because he was studying the Talmud. And probably some techniques from 2,000 years ago in a desert would be applicable to modern day Ohio, but probably not all. But he just insisted on following, what the Talmud said rather than talking to other farmers nearby and asking them, what's successful here.
Yes, interestingly, I think the Jewish Agricultural Society sent out these agents. It was like a precursor to what we know now as county agents who come and tell you about how to improve your soil and best farming practices. So they got a newsletter called the Jewish Farmer, which had information. And I think Bluma was really better at applying those things than Sender. She had the idea to put the farm in grapes, which was bringing a better profit than the kind of like truck farmy. Actually, Sender was he wasn't selling anything. He was just living himself off the produce of the land. So she figured out how to make it profitable. And they put more of the acreage into grapes and they were able to sell those.
Yeah, when she arrived in the United States, she didn't have such a warm welcome from Sender. And she says at one point, kind of wistfully, in his own way, Sender has been faithless to me. All the love in his heart belongs to this worn out piece of land. And she sighs, well, at least it wasn't another woman, but he's all his energy and passion goes into this farm.
One of the challenges for me in the book was to imagine myself back before the women's movement, back before, women really had very much choice about how to live their lives. And I think, some arranged marriages worked out great. I think women had different expectations about what marriage would bring. But certainly the idea was you would get married first and love would follow often. And that didn't really happen in this case. I think Bluma always loved Sender. He was a very handsome man and a learned man, but he never really loved her, and she's very aware of it. And it's a source of pain, but they have a partnership. And as he puts it, I think, it works. So she doesn't have that love, but she does hope that'll come for her daughters.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that this was based on family stories. Did you have to do research besides that?
Oh, absolutely, especially about historical events, as I mentioned, about the Klan, about the Spanish flu. Although, for example, the story about outsmarting the sheriff at the Shabbos table with the wine is actually a story about my grandmother. So several of the stories where she outsmarts people were actually true stories. That's apparently what she was like, although by the time I knew her, she was living with her daughter, and mostly when we came to visit, she was watching television and knitting. So I didn't really know her. But when I started hearing these stories as an older person, I thought, wow, she was really quite remarkable and somebody kind of worth resurrecting, if you will.
Definitely honoring her memory in this. Did you find any interesting tidbits in your research that did not make it into the book?
Nothing springs to mind. I will say in the first, there were several drafts of the book. In the early drafts, the story of Huddle, Bluma's sister, wasn't included because, frankly, I thought it was so incredible that no one would believe it. But eventually, I finally decided that I should include it. And because to me, it's like one of the great love stories.
Okay, well, go ahead and explain the love story because we haven't mentioned her.
Sure. In the book, Bluma's younger sister, Huddle, appears, and she has basically fled from home. Her family had billeted this young Jewish soldier who she fell in love with, and he with her, and they had agreed to marry. And he was just going to go to Yassi, where he came from, and see his family, and then he was going to come back and get her. And while she was waiting, she heard through the grapevine that he'd married someone else. And in, despair, she fled to the United States to live with her sister. And again, this is the true story of my great aunt Huddle. So, she made herself useful on the farm, but she never got over this guy and was not interested in meeting anyone else. And one day they were entertaining a peddler. It wasn't uncommon for Jewish peddlers to stop with Jewish families as they were making their way across the United States. And this guy said in passing, oh, I met some of your fellow farmers when I was in Texas. And this guy said he was from Romania. Maybe you know him. And it turned out to be the guy that my aunt had been hoping to marry. The story was, when he got back to Yassi, his rabbi approached him and said, look, there's this woman. She was married. She had an adulterous affair, and she was pregnant. And if she had this baby while she was single, the baby would be a mamzer, which is a very difficult category to belong to in Judaism because you're sort of ostracized. You can't marry anyone other than another mamzer. It's a terrible fate. So, but there's a loophole. If someone would marry her before the baby was born, the baby would not be a mamzer. So my great uncle agreed to do this, and the idea was he would divorce this woman as soon as the baby was born. But my aunt hadn't heard that part of the story. She just heard that he was married. So when the peddler told them the full story, they got in touch with him where he was living, and he came to get her. So that was, like, as I say, to me, one of the great love stories. They were, 1,000 miles apart, but he came for her, and they married.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And the small world that the peddler was able to connect them.
Yeah,
He must have a really wide route
yeah, yeah.
to connect them so far away. So is there anything you'd like to bring up about the book that I haven't thought to ask about?
Well, I guess I'd like to say something about the Yiddish. I'm very fond of Yiddish. I think there are things you can say in Yiddish that you can't say in English. There's such great old expressions and idioms and curses. So part of what I loved about doing the book was reconnecting with those and trying to work them into the story, because they were certainly a part of my childhood. And I think, as I say, Yiddish is just a great language. So preserving it is kind of part of my little personal mission.
Yeah, you did have a bit sprinkled through. Unfortunately, I only know a few food words, from my family. So, so you mentioned Tikkun Olam, and now is our Tikkun Olam time. So would you like to repeat your call to action?
Sure. The Jewish Farmer Network connects farmers all over the United States who are Jewish and kind of interested in incorporating Jewish teaching into the way that they farm. And they are, you should look at their website, which is jewishfarmernetwork.org. And they do take donations there. And they're keeping alive this dream of going back to the land.
Wonderful. I will include that link in the show notes. So if someone would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way?
I have a website, miriamflockauthor.net. Pretty sure that's correct. Sorry. And you can get in touch with me that way. That's probably the easiest thing.
Okay, great. Well, Miriam Flock, thank you so much for speaking with me about your book, Wild Grapes.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
If you are interested in any of the books we discussed today, you can find them at your favorite Board and Brick or online bookstore, or at your local library. Thanks to Dianki for use of his Freilich, which definitely makes me happy. This podcast is a project of the Association of Jewish Libraries, and you can find more about it at www.jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks. I would like to thank AJL and my podcast mentor, Heidi Rabinowitz. Keep listening for the promo for her latest episode.
Hi, this is Hannah Reynolds. I'm the author of A Practical Guide to Dating a Demon. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast. I'd like to dedicate this episode to my grandmother. She is from Paris, and much of this book is inspired by France. She really passed along her love of France to me, so I thought it would be nice to dedicate the episode to her.
The Book of Life is the sister podcast of Nice Jewish Books. I'm your host, Heidi Rabinowitz, and I podcast about Jewish Kidlit. Join me to hear my June 2026 conversation with Hannah Reynolds, author of A Practical Guide to Dating a Demon, at bookoflifepodcast.substack.com.